First one, in terms of restaurants, when you talk about the low-wage workers, does that include tips? Because a large portion of the restaurant employees are making double their wage because of tips. Did you include that in the study?
Yes, the income is out of Census Bureau data, so it's what people report as their incomes.
Okay.
And what we tend to see when we look at restaurants is people who have face contact with the public do get substantial tips. So
right.
Waiters, waitresses, bartenders do pretty well by tips.
Okay. And then another question, and sorry everyone, but I'm president, so I get to. The payroll boost of $7.6 billion with a $15 wage, does that include other increases? And by other increases, I mean, you know, if you have somebody who's making $12 an hour and at one company and another employee's making $8, they're going to expect the payroll differential. They're still going to expect to make $4 more than the other person. So there are going to be other raises that are required.
No. There are some surveys that suggest that some wage compression occurs. There's not any economic literature that actually documents it, but in surveys when employers have asked how they would cope with this or how they do, there's been some survey responses suggesting that there's some wage compression. So no, it does not assume that everybody would get a $4 an hour boost when the minimum wage goes up, right?
Okay.
So in 2009, when this first stimulus was implemented, I think that most people speculated that people were going to go out and spend those savings that they received in their taxes on product, but they actually paid off debt. Do you anticipate that that may happen initially?
You may have thought more about that than I did.
Just
well, I don't know if you were here for the slide that showed debt levels of different household income groups, but lower income households do have debt. A lot of that's oftentimes around rent. So paying off that debt is part of staying housed rather than being evicted. So, you know, certainly, but again, it is a local stimulus. If you pay your landlord money that you owe her or him, that's a stimulus to the economy.
Well, I'm glad you raised the landlord issue. I represent landlords at the California Apartment Association. You know, landlords have buildings, but they also employ a number of what we would probably consider low-wage workers, whether it's landscapers or painters, in order to maintain their buildings. We have a very tight rental market right now. We have about a 3%, in some areas 4% vacancy rate. Prices are just skyrocketing because we just don't have supply. And, you know, they're getting hit with a lot of increases, not just, you know, I mean, fire alarms used to cost $5, they're costing $46 because they have to be a certain kind and have to go into more rooms these days. So I'm worried about, you know, I understand the arguments of why living wage might be good for the economy, but we also have to think about where rental housing prices are going to go. I mean, they're continuing to go up. If they're paying more for the services they're trying to maintain their buildings, they might choose not to do that. Or we're going to see the cost and increased rental prices, which is going to be felt across all income levels. So I feel like there's a lot of things that are missing from this report that would need to be more comfortable with, you know, having extrapolated those. I mean, it's really easy to say, well, we might have a little bit of loss of business, but I think those have major impacts. I want to know where that other side of the equation is and see it played out, I think, in ways, because housing is a really big issue in the city, and it's going to be an increasing issue, and I think this could have a real impact on that.
Well, housing is a huge issue, and over half of our renters in the city are rent burdened, so rent levels are a big deal. Lack of affordable housing is a huge deal. So these are all big deals. And I think, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I do think there are both facts and there are values, and you know, part of this discussion that you're raising is an issue of values. One value is that it's a single economic fabric that makes things happen. It's people who do physical things and very tangible things, as well as people who think and organize, who make the economy work. And I think there's serious food for thought about how sustainable our communities can be over the long haul if there's a segment of that fabric that just is not viable, that just, that it's not sustainable for the people. In LA City, workers add about $200 billion in value each year. And for a segment of those workers not to get a share of the value they create that's sufficient to live by is a pretty big deal.
I'm not arguing with you about those points, but I think that when we make these policy decisions, we have whole other segments of business that are going to have a reaction to that. And what does that reaction also do to our local economy? And if we don't address those issues of how to increase supply of housing, it's like we do all of these things in a vacuum, right? Like, well, we're going to increase the rate, but yet we haven't addressed our housing issues.
Right.
And if we don't address those in conjunction with increasing the living wage, and I think it could be a perfect storm. I mean, we're heading towards, I think, a real crisis in housing availability and affordability. And so I just feel that we just talk about these things in silos, and I think that's what's frustrating.
Right. I think the sectoral analysis is very important, especially for stakeholders that are in various sectors. It's important to have that sort of specific focus to see what the impacts are. I remember in one of the slides that you shared with us, Dan, it did break out potential payroll increases for that industry sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. And I remember seeing that in terms of its relationship to the overall industry revenue, it was like a 1% increase. So that might shed some light. Clearly, there needs to be more research done about what that actually looks like and who's actually going to be paying that. But in terms of it might.
I think this is the slide you were talking about, Yvonne. Yeah.
Right, but the impacts look like based on the industry analysis that Dan did, that they're pretty minimal.
You have to understand too, in the city of LA, we have, I'll make this point and then I'll stop talking, is that we also have an entire segment of the housing industry that's under the rent stabilization ordinance. And they are not allowed to recoup their costs. They are allowed a 3% increase at a maximum each year. So they're already struggling, and this represents a lot of units in the city of LA. They're already struggling to maintain their buildings. So that's an important sector to look at too, because it's not like the big corporations who are developers and operators. These are the small mom and pop, and it represents a big segment of housing in the city of LA, and what's affordable housing too, and it's an increasingly aged housing stock. So I think that it has some impact on that.
I'm not sure how to formulate this question, and I'm not sure it's a question. When I was a kid, there were a lot of jobs for kids that now appear to be, and that was a long time ago, they now appear to be career jobs. And it would seem that that's because we're not necessarily creating enough jobs for careers, which means we're not stimulating the economy to create the jobs. And from an economist's perspective, it would seem that would be the healthy way to raise wages through the natural competition for staff. I mean, I know when business is good, I have to compete harder to hire good people. That means I have to offer them better benefits, better pay. I know when the economy's not, people are coming to me looking for jobs and they're willing to accept less. So by creating a minimum wage that may not reflect the real supply-demand aspect, are we creating a false economy that would be much better focused on trying to incentivize the creation of good, strong jobs in our economy, and growing the wages that way, and for sustainable purposes?
I think that's an extremely intelligent question. I mean, as I said, we've not recovered our employment levels from 1990. We've had about 16% population growth. So A parallel and huge issue for Los Angeles is that we are a stagnant economy. So the study looks at one issue, which is raising the floor of wages. There's a second issue that we believe is neglected, which is how do we come of age as a city and do something about shaping our future? That until 1990, it really worked for us to have beaches, to have sunshine, to have Hollywood, to have the Rose Parade, and just stay out of the way and let things happen. But we've run out of open space. We're a maturing urban area with a lot of problems, and leaving things alone has stopped working. And we don't have mature institutions that can address the issue of growth. What are our strengths and how do we get them to expand? So that's a separate issue. It's a huge issue, and it also needs to be worked on. So, but I wouldn't let one issue necessarily stand in the way of the other.
To piggyback a little bit on what Brad said, and actually what Beverly said, operating sort of in silos. I mean, I think I'd be interested to know in terms of the lower wage set that exists, what the average education level is, and I mean, and how does the drop correlate with education in Los Angeles, the availability, public schools, the spending per pupil, and so forth? Because it seems to me that there's a strong parallel between that dip in the wages and where our public education in Los Angeles has gone over the past 2 decades.
Well, you're absolutely right. The rate of low wage employment scales directly to level of education. So people with less education are much more likely to earn low wages. So you're absolutely right. It's a real issue, and the quality of education is a huge issue. So I would agree completely that that's an issue that's critical too, is addressing the quality of education. I think a reality for Los Angeles is that when aerospace collapsed, we had 1.1 million net out migration from Los Angeles County. So we had a huge exodus of people who left. And what saved LA's bacon and kept us from becoming Pittsburgh or Detroit with a declining population was a steady infusion of immigrant workers who are energized and hopeful and have built a new set of industries and made economic progress in their lives. But we've had huge demographic transformations. We've had a huge influx of workers from societies where education is not based on merit, it's based on class, and who've come here with relatively low levels of education, but energy and enterprise. And so, but for their children to succeed, because their children are LA's future, for their children to succeed, we need a better school system. No, Vic was next. You can ignore Vic.
Thank you. Two things. What Beverly was mentioning about the rent control and limiting as far as the revenue to cover the expense. That's one factor. Also, other businesses that even aren't rent controlled or price controlled, but market controls pricing, and you may be increasing your expenses as far as wages, but you're not able to cover all those prices, and so you have less profit for these businesses, and also the customers that are buying their products, they're paying more, so they can't buy as much elsewhere or wherever. So you've got a lot less profit overall, a lot less sales. That's going to hurt your state and federal income tax level. Also, when it comes to younger people, students, when you start putting a higher price on the time that people are paid for, you're going to look for better qualified people for those wages, and that prices students out. You have less opportunity for young people to be able to start getting good experienced as far as work, all the different factors involved. And so it really hurts in that way. We need kids to learn how to do work and be employed.
Well, those are kind of several different points, all of which are good. For your last point, I mean, I think it's a policy issue of do you exclude some groups of workers from minimum wage coverage? Do you exclude adolescents? Do you exclude people returning to the community from incarceration? Do you, and you know, there's a variety of people for whom any rung in the labor market is a huge gain. So do you make exceptions as a policy, which is certainly something that could be done. The earlier points that you made that this subtracts from revenue and profit for some businesses is real. I think one issue to keep in mind is that this is across the board, so it's not happening to one employer, but not another. It's the entire game is changing, and the rules affect everybody. So it's not that you're affected and your competitor isn't. Everybody is affected. And yes, it is a series of difficult adjustments. But what our review of the literature convinced us is that at the end of the day, it seems to work, and it seems, in fact, to create some stimulus. But it is, you know, it's a series of it would be a series of changes that businesses would have to adjust to. It would not be trivial.
I just wanted to, add in response to your question, Christina. There's actually been a study recently that was released by the Economic Policy Institute that showed that low-wage workers are more educated today than they were over 30 years ago. So now in 2012, almost 80% of low-wage workers have high school degrees. This is nationally. We don't have the numbers for Los Angeles, but I think it would be really interesting to look at for LA County and for LA City. So about 80% have high school degrees, whereas in 1968 only less than half, 48% had high school degrees. Nowadays, almost half in 2012 had some college experience as well.
We
Whereas
have an
only
extraordinary high dropout rate in LAUSD, so I can't imagine that's, it would have to be, we'd have to look at LA directly.
Well, that would certainly be really interesting research to do, but you know, this is definitely a national trend that low-wage workers, and this sort of speaks to what Brad, your point was, that people are doing, you know, jobs that, you know, young people used to do, but doing it permanently with high education.
I'll let Kevin be traffic cop. Okay.
So, you, in your presentation, you said that a modest increase in minimum wage has essentially minimal overall impacts on the economy. Can you define modest? Because we're talking about, as of July 1, this is about, if my math is correct, a 67% increase from $9 an hour to $15. You mentioned Card and Kruger study comparing New Jersey and Pennsylvania. What was the differential there? Because if this were to go in Los Angeles, you would have, within the course of a couple of years, about a $5 differential between the city of Los Angeles and Torrance or Glendale or Burbank or Santa Monica. And that's going to be a pretty substantial difference, and I think that that would have effects on a number of jobs, and especially on business creation. So in this, my questions then are, has any study been done on an increase of roughly 2/3 in the minimum wage, and have those studies looked at what happens with business creation, or does that, because an investor is going to be looking for a return on his or her investment. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to take you said a 4% hit on average here, I can go somewhere else with my money and create jobs or a business somewhere else where I'm going to get that 4% or more. Yeah. And on a multi-million-dollar investment, that's a significant difference in return.
Yeah. I think that a dollar a year series of steps would be typical, so you wouldn't, you wouldn't do $5 at once, you would spread it out over a series of years so that it's more manageable. And the issues you raise are real issues. I think a counter argument is that at the same time that you might have higher wages in LA City, you also are going to have increased buying power. So often these dollars that are going into wages are dollars that otherwise might leave the community. So yes, the restaurant might have a little higher prices than a restaurant in Torrance, or Santa Monica's a pretty expensive place to do business, but maybe than Torrance. But on the other hand, we might also have more buying power by having put more money in the pockets of people who in fact do go to McDonald's and Burger King and Denny's and so forth and buy food.
So, but then so does this then become a case, I guess, to the second, or the latter of my multi-part question, was what does this do for basically the creation of new jobs, or at least new businesses, because it seems very good. I look to a place like France, which is great if you have a job. If you're one of the people who don't have a job because it's so difficult to hire someone, if you hire them, if it doesn't work out, you can't fire them. So does that go somewhere else, and does this become even more of a case of haves and have-nots? If you're one of the lucky ones who have a job with a $15, or maybe if there's a wage differential, a larger sector, larger amount of money, and then everybody else is essentially even more reliant on government services? Has there been, it's basically been studies of what a large growth does.
Well, the suggestion from the literature on the subject is that the outcome tends to be a stimulus and tends to be growth. There is parsing in that process, and every year something, as I said, something like 30% of businesses go out of existence. So there's the business ecology is very dynamic. It's difficult to survive. You have to adapt all of the time, and so there's change all the time. There's new businesses starting, and for new businesses, I think it's the particular niche that they're in. I mean, if you're selling food, it's it's a relatively small radius you're looking to for your market, and having more buying power in your community is certainly a plus in that process.
Jim, you got a question?
Comment question. You started out with the comment that LA has lost a lot of businesses since 1990. True, quite a bit. Some of the reading I have done in that area, you have to look also not only at the wages, but at the regulatory environment, the tax environment, so forth in the state. There is a study that's done every year by a group called 24/7 Wall Street, out of Wall Street Journal, evaluates all of the states as an economic engine. And the last one I saw was November 2012. California was number 50 out of 50. Texas was number 1 out of 50 for 8 years running. And what comes out of these articles is that the regulatory environment, the tax environment, makes it a business unfriendly state, so businesses, people leave. So there's a factor I think that's got to put into your model. How would this change this particular subject if regulations dropped off, taxes came back down? What kind of spurring would happen in the business world to create new opportunities that you don't necessarily have to raise the minimum wage, but you have more opportunities where people can say, hey, I can take myself out of a minimum wage job into a better paying job, because that's what minimum wage is for. It's just to get you there, but it's not supposed to be something that you can live on, at least what I was taught in school.
Yeah.
Your thoughts, sir?
Well, you covered a little bit of ground there. I mean, and I think a fair amount of this is personal values rather than truth carved in stone. And my values around that would be that I think complex urban environments take regulation, that it's very hard to run a place like Los Angeles without some regulation. We've got a very fragile air shed. We put very much stuff into it. We can't breathe the air anymore. We're running out of water. We can't, congestion, moving any. We have lots of complex problems. As was pointed out, we don't have anywhere near enough affordable housing. And so these are all things we need government to do things about. My perception has been that people, by and large, don't get too much heartburn about paying taxes if they feel they get value out of their taxes.
That's fair.
So I think one issue is tax levels. I think another issue is effectiveness of public institutions. And I do think as a region that we have yet to come of age in terms of having institutions that address our problems as well as they need to.
Piggybacking on that, I would agree with you to the full extent of that statement. We have an immature government that looks to easy solutions. What you're offering with the wage, in my view, emotionally, I don't think a lot of people would argue, but it's an easy solution to a very and I don't even know if it's a solution, but it's an easy step towards something that doesn't really address the fundamental problem. And giving immature leadership that kind of solution, I believe, as a standalone, is extraordinarily dangerous to the fundamental issue at hand, because it's not really addressing the problem, it's addressing a symptom, however that's, and therein lies the big problem of promoting a living wage or whatever minimum wage as a solution to the problem as a standalone. And that's my absolute big concern with this.
Yeah. Well, as I said, our purpose was to stimulate a dialogue, and I think that ought to be part of the dialogue. What does a real set of solutions look like?
That's an outcome.
Yeah. I have concern because VICA has dealt with many issues of business flight from Los Angeles. I don't think you can address this just city of Los Angeles. You have to go to a larger geographic portion, whether it's the state of California. I mean, again, we've had so many issues of businesses leaving. Burbank, Glendale, really anywhere in the county. I mean, at a minimum, it would have to be LA County, and good luck. That's all I can say.
And Ventura's saying, welcome, welcome.
Exactly.
Well, if you look at the Business Journal list of top companies, it used to be LA centric. Now it's Calabasas and Glendale and Burbank, everywhere else except LA City. And there's a reason for that. It's not just happenstance. And
Hi. So I'm here representing the California Restaurant Association. They're one of our clients, and they are obviously, as we could see from the slides, going to be impacted like no other industry. And I think they are one of those sectors that needs to be pulled out and looked at separately, because not only that, their business is so different than any other industry. They're not retail. They're not labor, but they are labor, but they have this whole group of workforce that I know I worked my way through school working at restaurants. I never made minimum wage. They're making, people in the front of the house are making $25, $30 an hour. And then you're gonna increase their hourly pay, and there's no tip credits in this state. Jerry Brown took that away a long time ago, and bringing it back is very hard to do. So you're gonna pay people in the front of the house a higher hourly wage, and then what happens to the people in the back of the house where a good cook or a good dishwasher is already making at least $15, $20 an hour, they're gonna want more, so there's that compression we were talking about. So it's an industry unlike any other, and it's gonna take the weight of most of this. And although there are some restaurants that are big chains that can handle these kind of changes, the family-owned restaurants cannot handle these kind of changes. And right now, in California alone, restaurants are the second largest private employer in the state. So what do you do with all those people that won't have a job anymore?
Well, there's a bunch of pieces to your question. I think that the issue around tipped workers is very legitimate, and I don't, it seems to me in a policy discussion about this that, that it's, you know, we need to have our eyes open to the fact that some people get tipped income, and that's real. And you're right that restaurants are unique because it's really a small factory with a public service attachment to it. So you're manufacturing food and then you're, as a service of providing it to guests. So the restaurants are complex. Another side of restaurants is that you can go down a lot of boulevards and see just a lot of restaurants that don't charge a lot for meals and certainly don't pay very much to their help. And it's very hard to open up in that environment a new restaurant and pay a living wage and compete with all of the restaurants that are paying minimum wage or less than minimum wage. So one of the flip side of this for restaurants might be that it would change the rules of the game. That if workers are putting food on somebody's table, that the rules of the game are not just for that restaurant, but for all restaurants, so you get enough money out of that that you can put food on your own table.
We have time for one more. Again,
having to do with the restaurants again. As you raise those costs, there are already a lot of restaurants where waiters are not taking orders anymore. They're being electronically made. I mean, as far as the orders, so the waiters, so forth, they're just delivering the food, and you're going to run into an awful lot more of that as you raise the minimum wage. You're going to just run these people out of work completely.
Interesting thought.
We could be like the president or mayor could do an executive order. There you go.
don't go there. All right.
So thanks for.
Sure. I want to thank our speakers, Daniel, Yvonne, Patrick, thanks very much for coming. And also thanks again to our sponsors, State Farm and AT&T, for hosting today's informative discussion. And we'll see you all at the next FICA event. Thanks a lot.